There are still those in the Seven Kingdoms who call me usurper. Do you forget how many houses fought for the Targaryens in the war? They bide their time for now, but give them half a chance. They will murder me in my bed, and my sons with me. Robert Baratheon to Eddard Stark. A Game of Thrones Chapter 12, Eddard 2. Why was Robert Baratheon chosen as king in the wake of the downfall of King Aerys II, the Mad King, at the end of, well, Robert's rebellion? It might sound like a really silly question, given it was Robert's rebellion. It's kind of in the name, but the key word in this question is chosen. Because there are several different ways you can argue that Robert became the legitimate king of the Seven Kingdoms. Through the Right of Conquest, through his bloodline, and through his sheer strength to take the crown. All of these are true in their own way. But Robert becoming king is just as much of a choice, not even Robert's own choice, but that of powerful men around him. Men who could have very well taken power themselves if they'd wished it so. In this video, we're going to be analysing and breaking down each of the methods Robert Baratheon's claim to the Iron Throne is based on, their pros, their cons, how legitimate those claims are, and how ultimately, in the end, all of these differing methods, be it Robert's blood or by Right of Conquest, all lead back to the same thing, Robert Baratheon being a choice actually made by his supporters. In my mind, Robert's position as king is held up by three key pillars: Right of Conquest, bloodline, and support. Two of these pillars cannot really be argued against in terms of his legitimacy as king. They are just a fact. However, the third, support, is much more in flux, and is where this whole concept of choice comes into play. It's this concept of support and thus choice that facilitates Robert's ability to claim the throne via Right of Conquest and via his bloodline. While the rebellion became Robert's, it did not initially start that way. Depending how you interpret some of the expanded lore, the rebellion against the Mad King didn't really truly become Robert's until at the earliest the battles at Summerhall, after which he started to win battle after battle, and even recovered strongly from his losses. Why that time period in particular is a matter for another video, but the point is, at its onset, it does not really seem that the primary goal of rebelling is to crown Robert as king, just to remove Aerys and House Targaryen. What Robert became was a figurehead, and a banner for those wronged by the Mad King to rally around. The reason Robert's kingship is held up by these different pillars is because different houses supported Robert for different reasons. For example, Tywin Lannister's support comes from a very different place than, say, Hoster Tully or Eddard Stark. Everyone playing this game has their own motivations. These pillars represent compromise between these lords to ensure a unified idea of Robert Baratheon as king. An outcome everyone can find something to be pleased with. Another good but not perfect example of something like this happening is the piece found in the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons. King Aegon III was placed on the throne as a compromise between the Blacks and the Greens. For the Blacks, he's the oldest living son of Rhaenyra, whom they viewed as the rightful queen. For the Greens, he is King Aegon II's closest living male relative, with Aegon III also being the eldest son of Daemon Targaryen, and thus the oldest grandson of Balon the Brave, and thus the oldest living great-grandson of King Jaehaerys Targaryen. For the Greens, Aegon III is crowned using their preferred method of succession, male preference primogeniture. The marriage to King Aegon II's daughter Jaehaera also sweetened this deal. When you look back through a lot of peace agreements in Westerosi history, and even real-world history, no matter who's the victor and who's the loser, there's always some form of compromise before that peace can be reached. So the idea of the peace after the Dance of the Dragons also applies in some ways as to why Robert was crowned king, albeit the divides in the realm were not nearly as entrenched and as deep as the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons. Robert Baratheon led the rebellion, all commands came from him in the end. Tyrion Lannister to Varys, A Clash of Kings, Chapter 17, Tyrion 4. You can make a case that Robert Baratheon might actually be the legitimate claimant to the Iron Throne. After the tragedy at Summerhall, the size of the known Targaryen family is relatively small. At the start of the rebellion, we have Aerys, Rhaella, Rhaegar, Viserys, Aegon, and Rhaenys, with Queen Rhaella soon pregnant with Daenerys. At the end of the war, only Viserys and Daenerys are left, a young child and a babe, and there's not exactly going to be a lot of hunger to crown either of the Mad King's children for obvious reasons. While we cannot say for 100% certainty due to there being a lot of incomplete aspects to family trees, Robert Baratheon may in fact be the next person in the line of succession after Viserys, at the start of the war. In 245 AC, the youngest daughter of King Aegon V, Rhaella Targaryen, married the then Lord of Storm's End, Lord Aemond Baratheon. The following year, she gave birth to their only known child, a son they called Steffon, Robert Baratheon's father. Thus, Robert's grandmother was not just a Targaryen, but the daughter of a Targaryen king. There are a few other branches of House Targaryen we lose track of, marriages that remain a mystery. For example, the fates of King Aegon V's sisters, or his nephew, Prince Maegor, who we just lose track of as a babe. But it does start to look like the descendants of Rhaella Targaryen, Robert, Stannis, and Renly might actually be the legitimate claimants to the Iron Throne and the legacy of the Targaryen dynasty. If you really want to get technical, House Baratheon are actually, in a way, a Valyrian house, or at least a house of Valyrian descent, given their origins come post-Doom of Valyria. The founder of House Baratheon was Orys Baratheon. Not only was Orys the best friend of Aegon the Conqueror, there is significant evidence that suggests he was too Aegon's half-brother. The language used in many of the accounts of the conquest in Fire and Blood, and how other Targaryen kings view Orys, almost makes it seem it's an openly accepted fact. If Aegon's father Aerion did sire Orys, Robert Baratheon could trace his lineage right back to Old Valyria itself, to the likes of Aenar the Exile and Daenerys the Dreamer. House Baratheon, and thus Robert, could have deeper Targaryen roots than he himself might be willing to admit, because it's often mentioned that his grandmother was a Targaryen, but the other Baratheon links to House Targaryen, the fact that House Baratheon descend from House Targaryen, in terms of Robert, is almost completely forgotten. We actually see stuff like this happening a lot through real-world history as well, where after a conquest or a civil war, the supporters of the new ruler will try and find, or even in some cases fabricate, a link back to the old dynasty as a form of legitimacy. I'm sure if you played Crusader Kings at any point, you definitely know what I'm talking about. Given how much of A Song of Ice and Fire is inspired by real-world history, especially the War of the Roses, I would not be surprised if some of George R. R. Martin's ideas for succession comes from those eras in that respect. But at the end of the day, having this Targaryen descent, not just Targaryen descent, but recent Targaryen descent, means that Robert Baratheon has blood legitimacy backing up his claim to the throne, as well as the right of conquest, which in turn makes him a much easier choice for the lords to back than some other lord. Lysa's match with Lord Arryn had been hastily arranged, and Jon was an old man even then, older than her father, an old man without an heir. His first two wives had left him childless. His brother's son had been murdered with Brandon Stark in King's Landing. His gallant cousin had died in the Battle of the Bells. He needed a young wife if House Arryn was to continue, a young wife known to be fertile. The thoughts of Catelyn Stark. A Storm of Swords Chapter 2, Catelyn 1. We then had the next pillar, the Right of Conquest. Even if you don't really back the idea of Robert's Targaryen heritage as him having a legitimate claim to the throne, Right of Conquest is more difficult to argue against. The idea is Robert Baratheon won the Iron Throne, forming a new dynasty by destroying the old, and having the power to hold the Seven Kingdoms together. While of course Viserys and Daenerys can claim Robert is a usurper and that the throne is rightfully theirs, there's two ways you can kind of look at it. Number one, they no longer have a claim to the throne as the dynasty was destroyed and has been replaced by a new one. Or number 2, they are the Targaryen claimants to this fallen dynasty. Viserys can call himself king all he wants, but what is he tangibly king of? The Targaryen legacy? There's a reason Viserys has the nickname the Beggar King. If Viserys or Daenerys took the throne back off Robert, or Robert's descendants, while they might view it as them regaining their legitimate position, they would in fact be regaining it via the same method they lost it, the Right of Conquest. Here's the thing that is a little bit tricky if you dismiss Robert's Right of Conquest. If what Robert did was not that, then what does that mean for the Targaryen dynasty in the first place? When Aegon conquered the 7 fractious and warring kingdoms of Westeros and made them one, when his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys crowned him king of the 7 kingdoms on the steps of the Aegon fort, Aegon had no right to the land or the kingship. He took Westeros with fire and blood, and forged the 7 kingdoms as a realm under the power of the Iron Throne, via this Right of Conquest. Every Targaryen king that came after did so because of that right. If Viserys or Daenerys reject Robert's right to rule via conquest, you in then turn are disputing the very concept that allowed for the formation of your near 300-year dynasty. There is one argument you can maybe make against Robert's claim of right of conquest. If you take away the Robert out of the rebellion, or go back to the very start of it before it became Robert's, what exactly was it? A rebellion, a coup against the Mad King, not even led by a single figurehead or lord. It was a group of great lords, Arryn, Baratheon, Stark and Tully, and their bannermen, rebelling against the Mad King's tyranny, against the established dynasty. The argument put forward here is that the rebellion became Robert's after the fact, after he was placed on the throne by this group of houses. Therefore, did Robert even win the throne via right of conquest if this is the case? Now, I personally don't buy into this idea that much, because for me, Robert became a figurehead of the rebellion very early on. He very much made it his through his actions. Before we move on, I do want to touch upon how this idea of the right of conquest could play a role in the Winds of Winter, because it really helps to get across how important it is in terms of legitimacy in claiming a throne. Currently, we have Jon Connington, with who he is claiming to be King Aegon VI, conquering the divided Westeros from the Stormlands. If young Griff really is Aegon, then while he is technically the Targaryen heir, he would be winning the throne back via right of conquest. We are literally seeing this happen in the book. But the reason I believe the idea of the right of conquest has been so firmly established in creating both Aegon the Conqueror's right to rule and Robert Baratheon's is should young Griff actually turn out to be a Blackfire, like many popular fan theories predict. In terms of his claim to the throne, it doesn't really matter if he's a red dragon or a black dragon. His throne would have been won via right of conquest, so therefore some would argue legitimacy as a king regardless. I actually really like this idea of Ilario Mopatis and Varys knowingly claiming young Griff to be Aegon Targaryen to get the support of the Dornish and Jon Connington, and thus some of the Stormlords, and create this viable threat to the Baratheon Lannister rule in King's Landing, only to get him on the throne, then rug pull the surprise he's a Blackfire. I'm working on a whole video going into this idea, which will be coming soon. Lastly, before we move on, the same idea applies to Daenerys, should she retake Westeros from House Baratheon or young Griff. In practice, she'd be doing so via right of conquest. This would especially be true if young Griff really is Aegon Targaryen, or his true identity is never publicly revealed. Daenerys would technically have no right to claim the throne, given Aegon is the legitimate Targaryen claimant. Therefore, if Daenerys is going to claim the throne in this manner, she'd be claiming the throne via right of conquest. Therefore, if Daenerys does claim the throne in this manner, you are by proxy also legitimizing Robert Baratheon's claim of right of conquest as well. It's actually quite hard to say what one specific event started Robert's rebellion, because it kind of depends on your point of view and how far back you really want to go. There are some really obvious picks, such as Rhaegar Targaryen absconding with Lyanna Stark, the deaths of Rickard and Brandon Stark. I think you can also make a case for the tourney at Harrenhal, or maybe even events such as the Defiance of Duskendale, or at a push, the War of the Ninepenny Kings. Each of these moments pushed Westeros down a path of rebellion for different reasons. They set the stage, and all that was needed was a spark. A spark House Targaryen and the Mad King were inevitably going to provide. In my mind, I do think any of these points is a fair pick, but for me, the moment Jon Arryn refuses to send King Aerys the heads of Robert and Ned and calls his banners was when the rebellion properly started. The Rubicon had been crossed at that point. There was no putting the genie back in the bottle. Given the mental decline of King Aerys after the Defiance of Duskendale, it sort of seemed like something like Robert's rebellion was inevitable sooner or later. There's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that Rhaegar was well aware of all of this, which is why I believe the suggestion and rumours from the world of Ice and Fire that Rhaegar's intent with the tourney at Harrenhal was for it to be kind of a pseudo-Great Council, gathering all the Lords of the Realm together to get support for the removal of his father. A plan that very may well have worked if Aerys had not been so suspicious of Rhaegar and turned up at Harrenhal unannounced. Your father always had a little madness in him, I now believe. Yet he was charming and generous as well, so his lapses were forgiven. His reign began with such promise, but as the years passed, the lapses grew more frequent, until... Do I want to hear this now? Perhaps not. Not now. One day you must tell me all, the good and the bad. There is some good to be said of my father, surely. There is, your grace. Barristan Selmy in Daenerys Targaryen. A Storm of Swords, Chapter 71. Daenerys 6. In some ways, the story of Aerys II, the Mad King, is kind of tragic. He was forced to marry his sister, a match neither of them wanted, because his father believed the prophecies of a Woods Witch. Most of his family are then killed at Summerhall, and his father becomes king very suddenly, only for King Jaehaerys II then to die within 3 years, with Aerys becoming king at the age of only 18, with no immediate family other than his sister wife and Maester Aemon, whom at this time is at the wall, leaving very few to support him. He seems to have been a deeply unhappy man, who allowed himself to be exploited by men trying to climb the ladder of power. When you take a step back, you can see how this slow mental decline, from the start of his reign in 262 AC, all the way to the Defiance of Duskendale in 277. We don't know exactly what happened to Aerys during his 6-month captivity at Duskendale. There are some suggestions he may have been tortured or sexually abused, but whatever did happen broke Aerys' already damaged mind beyond repair. There's another 5 years after Duskendale before the rebellion begins in 282 AC, and Aerys has become extremely paranoid there were conspiracies to kill him or place Rhaegar on the throne. While a lot of Aerys' paranoia was unfounded, it may in fact be a bit closer to the truth than we first think. We at least know Rhaegar may have been planning to depose his father, but there is some evidence that there may have been whispers of a growing plot among the Great Lords, or at the very least, they've begun to move the pieces in place should a conflict break out. During the War of the Ninepenny Kings in 260 AC, it was one of the very few times the whole of Westeros, all of the great houses, fought together as one. During that conflict, key players over the next few decades of politics became acquainted, and bonds were formed between houses that never existed before. Nothing brings men together than shared experience and shared bloodshed. A young Aerys Targaryen, Tywin Lannister, and Steffon Baratheon were already close friends, but during this war, friendship also grew between Jon Arryn, Steffon Baratheon, Hoster Tully, and we also suspect Rickard Stark. This meeting of lords becomes critical in facilitating Robert's rebellion. The new Stark, Arryn, Baratheon, Tully friendships resulted in Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon being fostered with Jon Arryn. Later, of course, we'd also had the matches between Brandon Stark and Jon Arryn to the daughters of Hoster Tully, Catelyn and Lysa. These matches and the fosterings of Eddard and Robert Baratheon created this deep bond and connection between these 4 great houses of Westeros. Something like this had never happened before. When you later also add in the betrothal of Robert Baratheon to Lyanna Stark, it only joins their houses even closer together. Now, some fans like to argue this quartet of great houses have been planning the downfall of House Targaryen for decades, but I don't think it's actually that deep. What I suspect is as it became clearer and clearer that Aerys was falling into madness, men like Jon Arryn leveraged their friendships forged in the War of the Nine Penny Kings to make more firm alliances, to move pieces into place. So in the event one of these houses, or multiple, came under threat of the Mad King's tyranny for whatever reason, this block of 4 houses could act as one to, well, rebel if need be, or even something as simple as vote as a block in a proposed Great Council. So I don't necessarily think these 4 houses were planning a rebellion for decades, but there is logic to the idea, and this is the exact reason alliances and pacts happened in real world history. There is a lot we don't know, and the timelines are still vague to draw any firm conclusions. But what Jon Arryn facilitated was a situation of falling dominoes. If one of these 4 houses were attacked, then the other 3 would have their back. And this is exactly what happened with Robert's Rebellion. Rhaegar attacked both House Stark and House Baratheon by kidnapping Lyanna Stark. Aerys then attacked them again by killing Rickard and Brandon, and then calling for the heads of Eddard and Robert, which of course Jon Arryn refused. House Tully would be joining the war later by marrying Eddard to Catelyn in Brandon's place, and Jon to Lysa. The system worked. The domino effect of alliances meant the Baratheons, Starks, Arryns and Tullys had a realistic opportunity not just to form a rebellion, but one that was a real tangible threat to House Targaryen. So when Jon Arryn called his banners after refusing to kill his wards at the order of the Mad King, we don't actually know what his motives in terms of the endgame really are. Is it just defense? Is it to overthrow the Mad King and place, say, Viserys or Aegon on the throne, given Rhaegar was no longer an option, as per the Lyanna Stark situation? Hell, was it his intent to always place Robert, or perhaps himself on the throne? We don't really know. But what we can say is at this stage, I suspect after Robert had returned to the Stormlands and won the battles at Summerhall, then joining up with the other rebels at Riverrun, might be when the idea of placing Robert on the throne was floated. The gods be damned. It was a hollow victory they gave me, a crown. It was the girl I prayed them for, your sister, safe, and mine again, as she was meant to be. I ask you, Ned, what good is it to wear a crown? The gods mock the prayers of kings and cowherds alike. Robert Baratheon to Eddard Stark. A Game of Thrones Chapter 12. Eddard 2. As we've discussed, it became Robert's Rebellion after the fact. For most of the war, it was just a rebellion against House Targaryen. Realistically, the power vacuum that was left in the wake of the sack of King's Landing, after Jaime Lannister had killed Aerys, anyone could have sat themselves on the Iron Throne and called themselves king. Jon Arryn himself, even Eddard, if he was a different man. Tywin Lannister was extremely rich and powerful, with a large, fresh army. What was to stop him crowning himself? The rebels could have placed Viserys on the throne, but I think Tywin ordering the deaths of Elia Martell and Rhaegar's children showed us this was never going to be an option. But my point is, in that moment, the rebel lords could have named anyone king, yet they chose Robert Baratheon. Don't get me wrong, each and every lord had their own motivation for doing so. The motivations of, say, Jon Arryn and Tywin Lannister are clearly wholly different, but they can both find an element in Robert's claim that works for them. And this is where we come back to our 3 pillars: the Right of Conquest, Robert's bloodline, and his proven strength to be the figurehead that held the rebellion together through his own determination with his victories during the war. There is a pillar here each lord can get behind to some degree. It's a way you can bring even your defeated foes back to the table and create a unified realm and forge peace. Robert Baratheon was chosen as this figurehead because he represented all of these things. Out of all the limited options available, he fit the bill the best. Some of that is because of his background, some of that coming from the man himself. Before we end this video, I want to touch briefly upon something that often gets overlooked when talking about this kind of topic. People get so caught up in the political intrigue, they don't consider what the motivations of Robert Baratheon himself were. I find it hard to believe that at any point prior to the rebellion, he had any thought about one day being king. Yeah, he was high up the line of succession, but it would have taken another major event like Summerhall to put him in serious contention for the crown. I think at the core of his motivations is of course his love for Lyanna Stark, and his sheer hatred for Rhaegar Targaryen, for, in his own words, taking Lyanna away from him. It was that anger, that rage, that love for his betrothed that drove him to win those early battles of the war, to be one of the first men over the walls of Goldtown, to win 3 battles in a single day. We don't know when the notion of him becoming king became a factor. I suspect at Riverrun, but even then, from the language Robert used in A Game of Thrones, it very much feels secondary to Lyanna. Come the war's end, in a way, Robert chose to accept the crown because he had lost his primary motivation for fighting the war, Lyanna. Becoming a king, wearing the crown, ruling Westeros, constituted a victory over House Targaryen, even if in some regards, for Robert personally, it was a very hollow victory that would never bring him any true joy.